Welcome to a very special podcast. We are privileged to have both Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. J.P. Moreland at the same time today. This is the 20th anniversary of the book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Before we jump into the book, and we're going to look at some of the highlights of the book and talk about some of the background things that went into this writing, 20 years. Let's talk about your long relationship as friends and colleagues. Dr. Craig, how did the two of you meet?
Well, I had heard of J.P. Moreland for many, many years before I ever had the opportunity to actually meet him in person. In Campus Crusade for Christ circles, the name of J.P. Moreland was legendary. And so Jan and I were familiar with this man long before we met him. Now, Jan and I moved to Europe for quite a number of years. We lived in Belgium for about 7.5 years. And I can't remember that I ever met JP during that time. I'll have to defer to him. I'm not sure I met him before we actually began to collaborate at Talbot School of Theology. So JP, do you have any recollection of our first meeting?
You know what? I don't. That's different from yours. I do recall the first time I think I discovered you in person. I believe that it was 1973 at the Institute of Biblical Studies. And that's a summer training camp for Campus Crusade, now Cru, staff members. And there was an elective on the existence of God, and I believe it was taught by J. Edwin Orr, if I'm not mistaken. He was a well-known historian and had almost as many degrees as Bill. But I remember sitting in that class, and I was the sort of staff member that read Rudolf Bultmann and read atheist literature, and most of my staff friends just weren't into that. And so it was a fairly small class, and I can remember there was this one guy, and every time he asked a question, I thought to myself, now that is a darn good question. I was thinking similarly or else not. But I just felt a kindred spirit with him. And I don't think that I introduced myself to him at that time, but I made note of who he was, and I recognized that we were just on the same page. And it wasn't until his doctoral dissertation on the Kalam argument came out that I actually got a copy of it and poured through it. And it was so good, and I began to weave it into some of the natural theology that I believe, and so he influenced me there. But I don't think it was until the official time that we connected through Talbot that we first met. But I believe me, I was acquainted with this fellow, and he stood out to me years before that happened.
Let me ask you a question, JP. This fellow at IBS, was he wearing a floppy brown hat turned up in the front and torn off shirt with no sleeves on it and kind of a necklace with a dog bone around his neck?
He was sort of a sophisticated hippie. And
that was me.
It was you, yeah, I know. But you know what? I could have cared less because the questions coming underneath that hat were pretty good questions.
Wow.
Yeah, you were pretty weird, I got to admit.
I was. Do you remember a Campus Crusade staff member named Martin Morgan?
You know, I can't place that name.
Okay. Martin went on to work in Ireland. And when we were in Ireland, years later, after finishing my doctoral work in Birmingham, we were working with him in an outreach in Dublin. And one afternoon, he came home where we were staying. He was so excited, and he was yelling, "I know you! I know you! You were that guy at IBS in the hat!" And I said, "Yeah, that was me." And it was so funny because he was saying, look what this crazy guy that I thought was a loser and a lunatic turned out to be. And it was really quite a sobering realization. It was so funny when
that is a great
that.
story. That's a great story.
Dr. Craig, if you still have that hat, we could probably auction that off.
I don't want to give it up.
Oh, you still have it?
I've still
Okay.
got it. It's on the shelf in my closet. But that was one of the things that I had to give up when I married Jan. She said, your appearance puts people off, and you are hindering the gospel by putting a barrier between you and other people. And boy, I don't think anything else she could have said would have convinced me to change my attire and appearance. But for me, that was the trump card. I did not want to do anything that would stand in the way of the gospel. And so that hat has remained on the shelf all those years.
Well, my wife made me give up tube socks, so that was her contribution to that. Dr. Moreland, this is not the only project that the two of you have collaborated on. What else have you collaborated on?
Well, we edited together a book with Rutledge, on philosophical naturalism, where we gathered together a pretty high-level group that contributed to a critique of philosophical naturalism. And we co-edited that and wrote the introduction. Then we also collaborated on a book called The Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, where that's fairly well known. So that was another work on which we collaborated. And then there were a number of books that came out of the EPS Apologetics Conference, or papers that were read that came out as popular works for the general public that were apologetic in nature, and he and I were a part of a number of those together. But if I may say, the reason I have so admired and loved Bill, both as a fellow soldier in the Lord, but as just a friend, is two things. And the first is that he got the fact that as a Christian philosopher, one of our very first duties to Jesus Christ was to make a rigorous contribution to our profession. I think everybody who's called to do a job has an obligation to do that job well for Christ's sake. And I admired him for wanting to elevate the standard, and he's kept me on my toes over the years, and I've appreciated that a lot. The other thing was that even though he saw philosophy as having value in its own sake, for its own sake, there was no doubt that this gentleman was committed to the Great Commission and evangelism and pre-evangelism and building disciples that were confident about their faith. And that's what my life has been about. And so those were two things that at the level of deepest held values, Bill and I have shared for decades together. And that plus we've been really able to be open with one another when we've needed to just talk about our personal lives and so on. And there's just been a great respect and friendship between us. No spirit of anything but collegiality, no competition, none of that. I think both of us have, it's awkward to say, but a fairly humble heart. And we both recognize this isn't about us. It's about something much bigger than we are, and that's the source of our meaning in life. So that's one of the reasons why we found it quite easy to collaborate on projects, because we both were about the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that was a fundamental issue that meant a lot, I think, to both of us.
And I'd like to add that the Department of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, which JP helped to found, reflects the commitment to those same two values. And I wanted to be associated with a department like that. So back in 1994, when JP invited me to begin to teach part-time at Talbot, I began to do so. And up until the pandemic, every year I would be involved in teaching out at Talbot because it's such a wonderful community of scholars committed to philosophical excellence and to the fulfillment of the Great Commission.
Dr. Moreland, how did the idea of writing Philosophical Foundations come about? Did one of you approach the other to broach the subject? How did that happen?
Yeah, good question. I had you might say, just a passion and sort of a vision among my published works to have some of them be written for the Christian community that elevated their game, but wasn't so far above that they couldn't read it. And so I made a distinction between my academic published work and Scaling the Secular City and other books, but I wanted to see an intro text that was directed to Christians and in the development of a Christian worldview, philosophically informed Christian worldview, that was, if I just may say, more thorough and rigorous than anything that had been out there, but would still be accessible to people who were interested in this sort of thing. And so I approached a colleague about doing this together, and we began to work. And over the next few years, I was able, because I had a sabbatical, to write, I don't know, somewhere around 13, 14, 15 chapters. And this brother, for various reasons, was not able to continue with the project. And so the very first person in my mind, and had I known him when I started with the project, would have been my first choice, was Bill. And so I contacted him. I said, look, this is what we've got going. Can I send you some of the stuff I've written? Would you be interested? Well, I mean, he said, let me pray about it. And about 2 seconds later, he said, I'm in. And so we were on the same page about the type of book it would be. And it came about that way. And so I must say that Bill really would have been my first choice if I'd known him at that point. And I just didn't know him well enough to announce that. But it worked out, and I believe that in the providence of God, because this book has had an impact in people's lives that are just far beyond what I would have imagined, to be really honest with you. And there's obviously some kind of divine hand on this thing, and it's over my head, and I think Bill would say the same thing in the impact it's had. I have no clue how this has happened, but we're sure grateful. And God had a providential role in bringing us together to write this book. So I believe that this was on God's mind, and that he wanted us to do this together. And he providentially brought about the conditions where we were able to develop the book.
I'm curious of what the process was of writing the book. I suppose that the two of you got together, maybe outlined everything, and then filled it in. Dr. Craig, you want to address that first?
No, it wasn't like that. By the time JP approached me about this book, he had already written the bulk of the book. And he simply needed someone else to fill in certain other areas that he did not want to write on himself. Principally, they were the chapters in philosophy of religion. And so we largely wrote independently of each other. We, of course, read the other person's chapters and commented on them, but we didn't interfere with the writing of the other person. And so JP wrote most of the chapters. I did the chapter on logic and reasoning. And then I did a chapter on the philosophy of space and time, which was very near and dear to my heart because of my work on divine eternity. And then I did all of the chapters on the philosophy of religion.
Well, and Bill also did a chapter in the epistemology section
I
on
forgot.
religious epistemology.
Right.
So, it was probably 60-40, maybe 65-35, but it was, it was in that ballpark. And we both made substantial contributions. But what this says, Kevin, is that we just trusted each other. And there were, I can only recall maybe one area where we disagreed, and we don't agree about Platonism. And so when we wrote that chapter, I wanted to give Bill full sway to write whatever he wanted to write. I had already written a chapter in metaphysics where I talked about this. And so what we decided to do when he was writing this in context of God's aseity is that he developed his chapter, and then what I would do is I'd plug in an objection, and then he would respond to it, and then I would come up with maybe another one. And so it ended up being a very nice exchange back and forth. In fact, it wasn't like we were trying to get one another. If I felt like I could polish his response and help it, or my statement of something, we did that. And so I think that was maybe the only area where we needed to kind of team up. And it turned out that was actually a blessing in the book, and worked out just very nicely.
And Dr. Moreland, as I recall, you had a bumper sticker that said, "I break for universals."
Yeah.
And Dr. Craig has one that says, "I don't break for universals."
Yeah, that's right.
But I've never hit one.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it goes. But, I'm in California, and I actually pulled into a gas station once, and I was filling my car, and I brake for universals around my back license plate. So this other guy's filling his car with gas, and he says, hey, what do you mean I brake for universals? And I said, oh, it's a long story. He said, well, no, tell me what it is. I said, well, there are these things that are sort of objects outside of space and time, and because of that, you can't actually run over one of them. And so the idea of trying to brake because you're seeing one on the road is kind of an absurd idea. It's meant to be a joke. He says, oh, I thought it was maybe one of those sexual things where you were kind of, you were universal, So, people misunderstand universal. It was funny.
The title of the book is thought-provoking in and of itself, because it suggests that there are philosophical foundations at the base of the Christian worldview. Now, some people balk at that. We've had people literally push back during some podcasts, saying that the foundation is the Bible, the Scripture, not philosophy. Two things: how did you come up with the title, and how do you respond to objections like that, Dr. Craig?
Well, JP came up with the title, as I recall, but it seems to me that the answer to the question would be that there are both philosophical and theological foundations to a Christian worldview. So obviously you have theological foundations laid in Scripture for a Christian worldview, but that doesn't answer all of the fundamental questions that are raised by these theological doctrines. And therefore, there are also philosophical foundations that will include, for example, certain metaphysical theses like the existence of God, the reality of the soul, the objectivity of moral values. And then there will be epistemological theses to which one will be theologically committed, like the objectivity and knowability of truth. And so there are both theological and philosophical foundations that go to make up a Christian world and life view.
Dr. Moreland, do you ever run into that objection that you're founding your faith on philosophy rather than the Scriptures?
Yes. With regard to the book, I think, just to fill out Bill's answer, which I agree with, I think you could simply add that, our book's already hernia-inducing, so you can't cover both of these aspects adequately in one book. The fact that we chose to focus on one aspect implies nothing about our valuing the other. It was a limitation that we didn't want to do a 2-volume set. And so that's the reason we've zeroed in on this particular aspect. But I think that this objection tends to come from certain kinds of sort of old school reform thinkers who were along the lines of, say, Cornelius Van Til or Greg Bahnsen or people like that thought that giving evidence somehow placed something over the Bible's authority. And I just respond by saying that when you're within the faith, the scriptures are clearly my ultimate authority, in that if something contradicts the scriptures, it's false. But being within the faith, it does not follow that it is not helpful to growing in one's faith, that there are appeals to argument and evidence that strengthen the grounding for your confidence in the authority of the scriptures. And Paul appeals to all kinds of things in the book of Acts. He persuades people. He appeals to literature from pagan writings about God, and the prophets in the Old Testament use kind of a causal argument that the finite deities are not real, because he says, look at this effect. It's massive. Now, how can that puny little God you worship, and by the way, when he falls over, you got to prop him back up again. How is that going to explain all of this? And the implicit assumption is that cause is not adequate to explain this effect. Now, that's obviously what they're getting at, but it's not explicitly stated. The field of philosophy can help make that explicit so you gain greater insight into the text. If you're outside the field of the faith, then I think it's entirely biblical, both through the Old and New Testaments, to provide evidence and argumentation and things of that sort that are extra biblical to help answer people's questions and deflect some objections that might be holding them up. So this seems to be the way the apostles practiced evangelism, and it seems to be important for discipleship, as in Colossians, where Paul is thoroughly familiar with the sort of the pre-Christian Gnosticism in Colossae, and he uses that in his writings to say that pleroma you got there, I got good and bad news. The good news is there is a pleroma, a mediator between God, but it's not that hierarchy of things you got in there. It's Jesus. And so he takes their own philosophy and relates Jesus to it when it's appropriate. And I think that's what Bill and I were doing, especially his section on the philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. He's merely trying to use the tools of philosophy to unpack and to clarify and to rule out errors in people's attempt to systematize a biblical picture of God. And so philosophy is just a tremendous source of help. So it isn't an either or there, in my opinion, in so many ways.
The book is dedicated to Dallas Willard and Stuart Hackett. And beneath their names in the front, you quote Hebrews 13:7, "Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." Apparently, Dr. Craig, these men had great impact on the two of you.
Yes. The person to whom I dedicated the book was Stuart Hackett, who was my college professor of philosophy, and then later my colleague and department chair at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School after I finished my doctoral studies in philosophy. Hackett's book, The Resurrection of Theism, changed my life. I bought this book 1 week before graduating from Wheaton in a book sale at the college bookstore. And I read it then that summer. And I had been taught at Wheaton that there are no good arguments for God's existence, that all of the arguments had been refuted. And while that didn't seem right to me, I thought surely my highly intelligent professors of theology know what they're talking about when they say that these arguments are not cogent. And so I just accepted that. And then I read Hackett's book. And here he was laying out an argument for God's existence that I thought was just compelling and refuting every conceivable objection that one might raise against it. And the argument that was the centerpiece of Hackett's case, I later discovered to be the Kalam cosmological argument. And it was because of Hackett's book that I determined when I did my own doctoral work in philosophy, I had to write on this argument to settle my own mind as to whether or not Hackett were right, that this is a sound argument for a creator of the universe or not. And so that book was really formative for me in my philosophical development. And I had the privilege then, as I say, for 7 years of teaching at Trinity with Stu, got to know him and his wife Joan, wonderful Christian couple. And so it was a pleasure to dedicate the book to Stuart Hackett.
Dr. Moreland, Dallas Willard?
Well, I by the way, I had read Hackett's book as well, and I recognize this is a thorough, careful philosopher who develops an argument over a long space of time. And he was systematic. I really admired him, and so just want to add to Bill's statement. Well, I graduated from Dallas Seminary in 1979. My wife Hope and I came to Southern California to teach at the Crusade Seminary, the International School of Theology. And I was thinking about graduate work, and I ended up deciding to do an MA in philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. It was close, and it happened to have a really good department. And as a resident, the tuition was very low. So I went there, and I was getting my MA, and I was toward the end, and I wanted to go on for the PhD, and they were pressuring me to stay, and they were throwing fellowships at me, and I wanted to see if I could study under a Christian if possible. Well, I was reading Christianity Today, and I turned to the last page, and there was something on discipleship, and I read this article, and I thought, darn, I agree with this. This fellow's thought this through. And I looked down, and he was a professor of philosophy at USC. I couldn't believe it. So I called him, and I said, pardon me, sir, but Dr. Willard, but you don't know me. I'm at UC Riverside, and I want to go on for a doctorate, and I wonder if you would mind if I came in and visited with you and asked you some questions. And so we scheduled an appointment, and I drove into his home and walked in, and I was kind of checking his library out to see if I saw some old familiar friends, and there was J. Gresham Machen over there, and so I was thinking. So I said, I hope you don't mind, but do you mind me asking just a few questions? You believe in the triune God of Christianity? He said, oh yes, I certainly do. And I said, well, do you believe that the Gospels are historically reliable and that Jesus rose bodily from the dead, and that's good evidence for that? He said, yes, JP. He said, I settled that question decades ago, and I do think that. You believe in a hell? He said, if you want to know if I am a historically committed Christian and an evangelical Christian, the answer is yes, I am. And so I ended up applying and getting a full fellowship to go to SC, and he was my mentor. And after I graduated, he and his wife Jane took Hope and me under his wing as kind of actually as one of their kids. I mean, and so we developed a very close relationship with them until he passed away. We got to know each other's families, and I have great admiration for his commitment to Christ, and he shaped me a great deal.
Some of our chapter directors are curious about the editing process that went into this. This is a big book, and so I'm sure there's a lot of proofreading and editing. For a book like this, you want everything to be just right. So, Dr. Craig, maybe you can start with this. What was the editing process for the book?
Since we wrote our respective chapters independently of each other, we were each responsible for the proofreading of those chapters. And we tried to stay out of each other's hair. As I say, of course, we did read each other's chapters and comment, but then it was up to each individual. And I don't remember that there were any particular difficulties with the editing process. As I recall, at least, InterVarsity Press was just a dream to work with. There wasn't any of this sort of interference you get from some editors where they think they know how to express better than you do what
Yes.
you're trying to say. And so they try to rewrite it and insert things or without even telling you sometimes. But with InterVarsity at that time, I found the editing process to just be impeccable. Is that your recollection, JP?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the reasons that worked out so well is that Bill and I both like to make clear the structure of a paper we write. We like people to be able to follow our argumentative process. And so we both like to have a lot of divisions and subdivisions and subdivisions. And so we were both on the same page with that, and so we were both able to write chapters that were like each other in that respect. And so in terms of the structural layout of the chapters, we were just automatically on the same page. We decided that we would have a chapter summary at the end of each chapter and maybe a basic checklist of some of the key terms that were used in that chapter, and an extensive bibliography. So really the editors, all they had to do was to put this together. Our styles, I mean, they were of writing were pretty similar in this, to really tell you the truth. And so there was very little difficulty. They were just so helpful and servants of the process. It was a good, very good experience. As was, by the way, the very important revised edition of our book, that in my opinion was substantial. It did not simply correct things that were maybe a bit outdated in the earlier version, but we added a lot of extra material and reorganized some things, and it is a different book in a whole lot of ways. And so they were very helpful with us.
I want to second that because we haven't really talked about the revised edition of this book. It wasn't so much correcting things. I think JP and I consistently hold largely the same positions. But the extensions of the first edition with additional argument, JP added further chapters on the philosophy of mind. One of the most important chapters for me was adding a chapter on the doctrine of the atonement. There are three big doctrines philosophically in Christianity, and that is the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Atonement. Well, I had worked on the Trinity and Incarnation when we wrote the first edition, and so had chapters there, but I had not worked on the doctrine of the atonement. And so even though I was aware that the classic Reformation doctrine of the atonement was under vehement assault, even by other Christian philosophers in our day, I did not feel equipped to write a chapter on it. And that was remedied in the second edition. By then I had completed my book on atonement and the death of Christ and was able to give a robust defense and articulation of a Reformation theory of the atonement. So from my point of view, that really helped to complete and fill out the section of the book on the philosophy of religion.
The book's been out for 20 years now. Have either of you been able to gauge the impact of the book? Any personal stories or feedback that you received that you remember? Dr. Moreland, you kind of hinted at this earlier, that you noticed that there's been quite an impact.
Well, I'll say a word. I think Bill might be a good person to ask on that, but as I see it, the book is accomplishing exactly what we hoped. I believe that it has become sort of the place to start, the go-to book with people that really want to get in deeply as Christians to philosophy. Now, I don't mean by it's the place to start if you haven't read anything in philosophy. There are intro texts that might be better, but for those who've been around the group for a while and they want to dive in deeper and kind of get an exhaustive deep dive into this subject, this is pretty much it. And I've had emails from people who said that it saved their faith, that it answered questions. I think one of the things that I've received when I've spoken most is that what this did for people is to role model that Christians are not afraid of questions. That in fact we welcome them. We don't if we want, all we ask is to have a level playing field. That's it. That's really the only thing we ask for, is just a fair chance to make our case. And a lot of people are in the church afraid of questions and think they're all smoke screens for emotional issues. And I know some of them are, but there's still the questions there at the end of the day, and it needs to be answered. And people, I think, have seen us perhaps role model that in the book, that we have kind of if we make a claim, we don't just assert it, we take on the best problems against it as we can find. And that role modeling of how a Christian a person who wants an intellectual life should live life, I think, has been a great encouragement to people. Bill, I'd like to hear from you on your experience.
I am aware from emails and so forth that the book has been very widely adopted as a textbook in Christian colleges and seminaries. So for many Christian students who take an intro course in philosophy, this book has become their introduction to Christian philosophy, and that is very gratifying. The ironic thing about that is that I, at least, have never used the book as a textbook. I've never assigned it in any of my own classes, and I wonder, JP, is that the same for you?
Yeah, I've never used it.
Yeah, it's really more for undergraduate and seminary students,
right?
Not for the kind of students that JP and I teach at Talbot, which are graduate level students. But it has been very widely adopted on that undergraduate level, and translated into other languages. For example, it's in Brazil, in Portuguese, where it's caused quite a ripple. And it's also in Korean in South Korea. And I think there's some other languages as well. So it's having actually a worldwide impact through these translations.
Here's another question from some of our chapter directors. Were there any major areas of philosophy that you intentionally left out of the book? Dr. Moreland, do you want to begin that?
Yes. I think philosophy of law and political philosophy are extremely important, but I don't think they're fundamental. I believe metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory are fundamental, and then those are then applied to issues in philosophy of religion and so on. I think that while these are important, I think that we wanted to try to get at these underlying ground level basic branches of philosophy that are really at the root of a Christian worldview and its overall truth and justification. So that was our thinking there. But yes, some would probably add aesthetics. That doesn't happen to be a huge interest of mine. But those would be some things that would come to my mind. Bill, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, that's so interesting, JP, to hear you say that, because as I mentioned, I left out of the first edition any discussion of the doctrine of the atonement. But when I did treat that in the second edition, philosophy of law became absolutely central to that, because it is in the philosophy of law that the theory of punishment and competing theories of justice are most discussed.
Right.
So in the second edition, we do at least dip our toe
Yes.
in the water of some philosophy
Thank
of
you.
law.
That's right. That's right. Good.
I think that if you do a third edition, you guys are going to have to do something on artificial intelligence, because everybody's going crazy over that
Yes.
these days.
Well,
that's a weird subject, isn't it, Dr. Moreland?
Well, yes. There's so much confusion about it. And actually, in our book, there is a fair amount about it. In the section, especially the revised version, where there's a fairly well-structured section on the nature of consciousness and then the nature of whatever it is that has consciousness. And the different forms of artificial intelligence, and there's more than one, are actually rooted in a computational theory of mind, where the brain is essentially viewed as a computer, and that would be what some call machine functionalism. And so if you understand functionalism and its limitations, then I think it becomes pretty clear that artificial intelligence, which is just a specific version of a certain form of functionalism, has got the same problems that face machine functionalism in general. So, for example, John Searle wrote a famous thing called the Chinese room argument, and it's widely used in philosophy of mind. We have a discussion of it and a discussion of some criticisms of it in Philosophical Foundations. But Searle's main point in writing that was to come against a strong AI, and so Phil Mind and AI are really AI is really just an extension of topics in philosophy of mind, and those are pretty well. I think they're pretty well covered in our book, although I don't deny that it wouldn't be a good idea to specifically have a chapter on that, because it's become it is a thing, and I would agree that might be an important thing to do.
Well, what you're saying is that this book will give you a good philosophical foundation to engage artificial intelligence.
Well, who would have thought?
Which is a good thing. That's good. You know, the book begins on philosophy and logic. Dr. Craig, I believe you treated these. Why start there? Why is it important for followers of Christ to engage in those topics?
What Greek is to the New Testament scholar, logic is to the philosopher. It's part of the toolkit of his trade. And without proper mastery and understanding of these tools, one will not be able to be effective in doing good philosophical analysis and argumentation. And I do think this is an area where very many popular level books on apologetics and logic are quite weak. I've noticed that popular level books on reasoning tend to focus on informal fallacies like begging the question or ad hominem arguments. But what I think is critical is that our students learn, first and foremost, the basic rules of inference that govern sentential or propositional logic. There are only about 9 of these basic rules of inference that govern all of reasoning. And so it's just, I think, vitally important that the students master these rules of inference in propositional logic. But then I also wanted to give them a taste, at least, of modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity. The great Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has said that every theologian needs to put in some measure of study of modal logic. That's quite a recommendation. And so that was an important part of the book. And then finally, I wanted to include something on counterfactual logic, which is so critical for the later discussion of middle knowledge and the doctrine of Molinism, which has to do with these subjunctive conditional statements like, if I were rich, then I would buy a Mercedes. And these counterfactual conditionals or subjunctive conditionals have a rather different logic than indicative conditionals do. And so that needed to be covered as well. So it just is a kind of primer to acquaint the student with these fundamental tools that will then be applied throughout the remainder of the book and throughout the field.
Dr. Moreland, I hesitate to even bring this up because we will be here all night, but everyone's curious about mind-body dualism.
Yes.
And you wrote the chapters, the sections on that. There are several people, there are plenty of people, I'm sure, watching this interview who haven't yet gotten the book. Maybe you can briefly speak to the question of what mind-body dualism is and what position you take in the book.
Well, let me back up and say very quickly that this has become one of the central issues of today, because as one person put it, once the Bible died, God died, and once God died, a man died. So now the fundamental question that's being asked today is, what is a human being, or what is a human person? And every field seems to have its own answer to it. And I've been doing a lot of reading lately in postmodern constructivism. And it is the fundamental problem at root with that whole movement is a completely misguided understanding of what a human person is. So the mind-body problem is really a host of several problems, but it is essentially, what exactly is consciousness? Is it immaterial? Is it physical? What is the thing that has consciousness? Is it a soul or an ego of some sort? And if so, what kind of a substantial entity is it? Or is it some kind of physical object like the whole organism or the brain or a region of the brain? And so this is so important today, but you've got to be real clear, because this has become a dominant field in philosophy for a long time. And so it's got its own literature, and there are very fine distinctions that have been made for a long time, so that if you say, well, he's a reductionist, I mean, there are at least 7 different kinds of reductionism. And if a person says they're a reductionist, I have no idea what they're talking about unless they clarify it. And then there's what's called non-reductive physicalism, and I don't know what that means. And I mean, Nancy Murphy is supposed to be a big non-reductive physicalist, and I kind of paneled off against her at an EPS conference. Bill was there. We had a panel of Swinburne and Ravenscroft and a number of others. And I said to her during a break, I said, Nancy, for the life of me, I don't understand what your non-reductive physicalism is. Are you a functionalist, or are you a property dualist? And because it looks like, and she said, well, I'm actually a property dualist. Well, boy, you could have fooled me. The point I'm making is non-reductive physicalism is an ambiguous claim. It needs to be clarified. And Christians who are deeply interested in theological anthropology, the tools that have been developed in philosophy of mind are extremely helpful. In fact, this means so much to me that a former colleague and now professor, Brandon Rickabaugh, and I have what I would consider to be a magnus opus coming out this spring with Wiley Blackwell. It's going to be a 400-page book, and it's going to be called The Substance of Consciousness. Thanks to Bill suggesting that title to us. And the subtitle is A Comprehensive Defense of Contemporary Substance Dualism. And I am proud to say that our section on this, which was expanded and reorganized, I think makes very clear this whole field in something like 5, 6, 7 chapters. And I'm very proud of our book in this regard. I think it does a really good job of giving people kind of the big picture and the terminology.
There's so much that we could talk about in this book. And for the 20th anniversary, Dr. Craig, maybe you can summarize something very important that has come up. The two contrasting views that you have on the version of Platonism that Dr. Moreland defends, and then you being an anti-realist about abstract objects. Was there a lot of discussion back and forth on this? And what are the two views in a nutshell?
Well, the two fundamental views could be divided between realism and anti-realism. The realist says that there actually are abstract objects like numbers and propositions and properties and possible worlds, and sometimes maybe even works of art or works of literature are regarded as abstract objects, whereas the anti-realist says these things don't really exist. It can be convenient to talk about these things, and we can say truths about them, but it doesn't commit us to their objective, mind-independent reality. And as JP mentioned, this was, in fact, the one and only issue on which we disagreed in the first edition of the book. In the section on divine aseity is so funny because I wrote one paragraph, JP wrote the next paragraph refuting me, I wrote the next paragraph responding to him, and he wrote the final paragraph refuting me. And we just left the issue unresolved.
Yeah.
Well, that was before I did my in-depth work on the doctrine of divine aseity. I worked on this for 13 years. And by the time it came around to revising the second edition, I think I was able to rewrite that section in such a way that we could both be happy with what it said. It basically lays out the different versions of realism that are available and the different versions of anti-realism that are proffered today. So it offers a kind of taxonomy of various views and invites the reader to explore these and see which one he finds most plausible.
We're about to run out of time, but as we wrap up, I wanted to ask the two of you what you're currently working on. Dr. Moreland, begin with you.
Well, I've just had about, I think it's now 9 articles published or will be published in journals. Some of them came out of my book, but I did about 3 or 4 new ones. And I've been working really on a couple of things, and one is advancing my understanding of topics central to our defense of the soul, and that has taken me into certain theories of colors and color perception that are more scientific in nature, and I've also been doing some related work on ethical non-naturalism, which, depending on which person you're talking about, we might just say is the attempt to sustain objective moral rules or principles, maybe duties, and intrinsic value without God. And I just had an article published after extensive work on Russ Schaefer Landau and his views on this. And so I've been working on areas that kind of beef up this whole enterprise of natural theology and engaging in theological and philosophical anthropology. Those have been central to my recent work.
Dr. Craig?
There are a good many people doing philosophical theology in our day, but almost no one, in fact, I would say no one, has attempted to write a systematic philosophical theology. And at Jan's encouragement, this is the project that I began to work on about 2 years ago. And I am in the midst of writing a systematic philosophical theology. I've completed the prolegomenon to the series, a locus on the doctrine of Scripture, a locus on the doctrine of faith, a very large locus on the doctrine of God, including the attributes of God and the Trinity, and an excursus on natural theology with various theistic arguments. And currently I'm writing the locus on the doctrine of creation. And this has been so fascinating, Kevin, because it's taken me into scientific origin of life and evolution of life studies. And so just today, I was working on the section on evolutionary biology and how best to integrate contemporary evolutionary biology into a Christian world and life view.
Dr. Craig, any chance on the two of you ever collaborating on another book?
Well, I think that JP and I are both open to the possibility, but I have to say that for me, this systematic philosophical theology is a 10-year project, at least, and it has become an obsession. So until I can get that thing out of the way, I doubt that we'll be collaborating on anything major in the future.
Let me speak for everyone and tell both of you, thank you. Thank you for not only for writing this book together that has had such meaning and impact on so many of us, including me, but also your individual ministries, your role modeling as friends and colleagues, and we appreciate the two of you being here today. Let's do it again.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.